Is the Good Advice Podcast a political podcast? Why not? Why don't we talk politics on the show? I mean, business and politics, these things are intermingled in some way, right? Maybe, maybe not. Hey, we're going to dive into it today with a little bit of a more meta conversation about the podcast. So if you're a first-time listener, hey, my name's Blake Benz. I'm the host of the Good Advice Podcast. Thank you so much, by the way, for checking out the show. And thank you for tuning in to a little bit of a conversation around how the podcast operates. Today's show is a little bit less about a certain business concept and a little bit more as to why we do the things that we do here on the podcast. Hey, before we dive in, we have a word from one of the businesses that sponsors the podcast. Thank you to the businesses who advertise on the show. And also for those of you who support the podcast on our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. I so appreciate you. Let's hear this quick ad and we'll be right back soon. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. All right, so like I said, today's a little bit of a meta conversation. We're talking about the podcast, why we do the things we do here on the show. I don't know why I'm saying we. It's it's just me here, unfortunately, on the podcast. What's my approach? Kind of what's my thinking? And this is really less of a like philosophical conversation, and it's more of, we are living in a time where politics and political conversation is such a central part to discussion. It is almost impossible on social media to see an opinion about a certain political thing. And I don't mean anything in particular. I'd say like any political thing. You don't have to look far before seeing something, somebody's take, somebody's opinion, somebody being a keyboard warrior. I mean, I feel like I'm just constantly seeing, and especially, even on like LinkedIn, for example, I'll see takes from people that I don't even follow, that I'm not even friends with. It's just, I've gotten so much engagement on their post that, LinkedIn's throwing it up to the top of many people's feeds. It's feeding the algorithm. I bring this up because I occasionally do get energized feedback, and I have in the past even gotten hate mail in the past about certain things I've talked about that someone has perceived as being a political insight when really I was just having a conversational point about something. The specific example that I'm thinking of is I've done many podcast episodes on wages and paying your people a fair wage. There is enormous data out there, by the way, on what someone leaving your business will cost you. And the answer is, I think it's somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000 in lost productivity and having to hire that position for an executive role or a senior leader role. It is typically the value of their salary, if not more. And I've heard lots of stats over the years about this. I'm not giving a more rigid stat just because I can't remember, and I don't want to misrepresent any data. But I talk a lot about wages on the podcast. I tell a lot of stories about wages. I tell lots of stories about conversations about wages. I talk, one episode that I did was on understanding Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understanding that someone is never going to be a high performer for you when they're worried about what they're going to eat that day. When I say worried, I don't mean are we going to Chewy's or are we going to, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who has no money in the bank, they have no groceries, they have no food, they literally don't know what to feed their kids that day. That person will never be a high performer for you. I'm not saying they won't be a hard worker. I'm not saying they won't be a well-intentioned worker and a moral, good, trustworthy, awesome person. They'll never be your best employee because when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we look at the peak of this pyramid, when we look at the peak of human creativity, when someone innovates, when they're literally evolving the way they do business and thinking how to do business better, this only happens when their basic foundational needs are met. So I have done an episode in the past talking about the cost of living. I've done episodes where I talk about there is not a single state in America where minimum wage full time will pay for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. So how can you expect your employee to be that overachiever if they literally don't make enough money to live, to have a place to sleep? I've talked in the past about major businesses that have done really well, and these businesses that have been very open about paying their employees very well. I've done many episodes about understanding how so many businesses will do pizza parties or these little silly employee celebrations things in order just to get around paying their people more money. I've had episodes about, let me tell you guys, 6 years of the podcast, 500 episodes. We've had a lot of conversations on this topic. But I had one particular episode where I talked about, you got to pay your people well. You just got to. You got to pay them fairly, pay them well. Why should you be surprised that they left and went somewhere else? Understand that your brand is not so meaningful to them. It is to you because it's your business, but it's not to them where they're not going to go somewhere where they're going to make more money. And we love to talk about people don't quit businesses for money. They quit it for they work where they're valued. And it's like, yes, that's true, but nothing speaks value more than a dollar sign. I'm sorry to put it that way. It just is what it is. Literally, it just is what it is. I'm telling you. So I put out an episode that was around this or talked about this, and I got this email later that day. And the email basically read, hey, Blake, I checked out your latest episode. I had no idea you had become such a socialist. And I read the email, and I laughed, and then I read it again. And I kind of was just like, okay, I'm really surprised that is what that person got out of that episode. And over the years, I've had probably nothing that overt. I mean, I've had some really negative comments and negative criticisms, but I've learned over the years that I'm going to have a take on something that people just are not going to agree with. But inevitably, I do get there are conversations around why don't you talk about this political issue or that political issue in the context of business? What do you think about immigration and how it affects businesses and skilled labor? And which candidate do you like more? And who's going to be better for small businesses? And hey, it's an election year, so which candidate is going to, put more money in my pocket? Like, I don't talk about any of that stuff. And that has inevitably led to people either directly or indirectly, either asking why or just being like, hey, it's a business podcast. Why don't you talk about these things? The reason that it's not a political podcast, and by the way, it's never going to be a political podcast, is I'll give you a personal reason and I'll give you a professional reason. So the professional reason is because I believe that how well your business does is most directly tied to what you can control. It is not to say that there are not things that you can't control that affect your business. If you owned a restaurant in 2020, COVID obviously affected your business. It was obviously outside of your control. And But on the same token, that is a freak deal. It is rare. I would hope to God once in a lifetime, please God, I would hope that these kinds of cataclysmic events are incredibly rare, microscopically rare. What we tend to do as business owners is we tend to then point to things out of our control and say that those are the reasons why our business is failing. So here's a good example. I'll give you two actually. Someone might say, oh, it's the economy's tough. Everyone's complaining about inflation, so no one's buying from me. And yet, I can name off a handful of businesses in the same persons who has said that in their industry who's making lots of money. But it's easier as a business owner to point to these things rather than looking in the mirror, because looking in the mirror is very difficult. And by the way, this is just human nature. I haven't discovered anything super interesting about this. I'm the same way. It is human nature for me to want to blame someone else or point to someone else, or that was your fault. That wasn't my fault. It's just how we operate as people. So getting better at business means getting more comfortable with looking in the mirror and coming to terms with what can I actually control. It has not been easy to run Good Advice over the last 6 years through a pandemic, a crazy economy, widespread political insanity. It's not been easy, but I have a job to provide. I have a family to provide for. And so it's up to me then to get over those things in the sense of not making them the priority of my life and focus on what can I be doing to do business better. So that's the professional reason. We don't talk about these things because I don't talk about these things. I want to say we don't. Some of you may do this. I don't talk about it because I think it's engagement bait. I think it's engagement bait. I think if I put up a podcast episode that was titled, "Who's Better for Your Business, Trump or Biden?" I think people would listen just to hear whatever spicy take there might be. I think, oh man, now I'm like trying to think how to choose my words. I don't necessarily want to say that anyone who does that is engagement baiting. However, y'all, if we're on social media, we've seen the posts. We know when someone posts something just to get people to engage with it. I've seen, and I think about this myself, even as like a marketing guy, I'll be doing the copy for one of my posts and I realize, okay, wow, hang on, that I really put a little bit too much pizzazz on that one and I need to dial it back. I had social media brain. I need to dial that back. But we've seen the post where, it's meme to death on LinkedIn where the person says, like the most egregious example that I saw last year was my sister died. Here's what it taught me about doing business better or something like that. That actually, I unfortunately just used the tagline of my podcast. So I did not post that. My sister is alive and well. Both of them are great. But it's been meme to death seeing stuff like this where you're like, come on, man, you're just baiting for engagement. So I don't do politics professionally speaking, because I don't think it's worth having that conversation. I don't think it often informs you as to what you can do today for your business. And I think often it's just engagement baiting. It's getting people to, frankly, a lot of times it's, if they're not doing it to engagement bait, it's just to continue to build an echo chamber on either side. So that's the professional answer. Here's the personal answer. The personal answer, this is going to really tick some people off. The personal answer is that I personally believe that 90% of the conversation on politics is an absolute waste of time. I think it's an absolute waste of time. I think we live in a culture where people they feel like to operate as a human being, that means giving your latest take and engaging with people on social media about how their take is wrong. And you owe it to them to stand up to them. And you owe it to the world to share your take. Like, personally speaking, I am really not that interesting. And as one random dude, what I think about something is fairly insignificant. I mean, it just, I mean, if you're a first time listener, you're probably like, well, okay, maybe I shouldn't listen to the podcast then if everything's insignificant. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry. I just don't take myself that seriously. I just don't really, I have some, it's good advice, not great advice, but I have some good advice on business. I have, occasionally a good idea, but I just don't take myself too seriously. I say this because often in politics, you have so much virtue signaling on either side of people like full on debate mode. They're living vicariously. They never made it on the debate team. And now's the chance to finally have that conversation. I think there was a time in my life where I was really engaged politically, probably for about 4 or 5 years. And I had this aha moment where I thought to myself, is my life any better today because of how involved I have been in politics? And I could not think of one good thing in my life because of my engagement in politics. I couldn't think of one. Literally, I could not think of one. Of all the conversations I had had, the news I had read, the commentary I had consumed, I literally looked back and thought, am I a better man? Am I a better father? Am I a better husband? Am I a smarter business owner? Do I love people better? I was kind of just going through all the things that I care about as a person, and I literally could not think of one link between those things that I value and the general political sphere. And so for me personally, I think that the majority of politics is a waste of time. That is not to say that I don't have things that I care about. That is not to say that I don't have a take. That is not to say that I don't feel strongly about certain things. I just do not, maybe it's cynicism. I don't know. I just have not seen any meaningful fruit from long-winded back and forth conversations. And, it just is what it is. And I will say, I do get a little resentful from people who are like, it's your duty to be engaged. It's your duty to be informed. And it's like, well, I can be informed, but what does engagement mean? What does real engagement mean? I mean, to me, engagement is voting. To me, engagement is having honest dialogue with someone who's trying to understand something better. Honest dialogue for me would be something like, hey, so like, why does minimum wage matter? Hey, so like, should business owners want the minimum wage to be raised? And that conversation is usually, by the way, less of a political conversation. It's like, hey, I don't think the question should be, should the federal government change the minimum wage? I think the question should be, and this isn't like the meta question. I have an opinion on minimum wage, by the way, which I'll just go ahead and say, I think it needs to be higher. I say that very confidently. I think it needs to be higher. $7.25 for the last 20 years. It's insanity for how things cost. What the price of things today? Like, come on, this is just a no brainer in my mind. But maybe who knows what I know, right? But I mean, what do I know is what I mean to say. But when someone asks me that question, it's we could have a political conversation. Let's talk about the history of the minimum wage. Let's talk about which party. Like, give me a break. Like, literally, give me a break. Such a waste of a conversation. Instead, hey, thanks for asking. I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you pay your employees. Let's talk about what motivates someone. Well, I don't want someone just to be motivated by money. Okay. Is someone who's looking to pay for their bills, is that an immoral thing? Is that a poor character trait? Is this someone who is greedy or just someone wanting to be stable? Let's process it together. Let's figure that out. Hey, I want to understand. What's your take? What's your perspective? Like, these are honest dialogue conversations where we both walk away with a better insight on how to do business rather than this virtue signaling pizzazz that goes on social media, on a wall, on stage, what have you. I just don't do it. I just don't care about it. It means nothing to me. So doing that. So all that to say, here we are. It's not a political podcast. It's never going to be a political podcast. It just won't. It just won't. I just don't think it brings value to people in the same way that talking actual things that work makes sense on the podcast. And the reason I did this episode today is I want this to be for you long-term listeners. I got a lot of long-term listeners. I want you to understand that a lot of times when I'm talking about an issue on the show, I'm not dancing around something. I'm just literally talking about the issue, because I've noticed over time that when I talk about an issue, it's people who politics is part of their identity. Like they can't separate. And this, I'm not necessarily hating on you, because statistically, this is some of our listeners. Politics is such a key part of who you are that you can't separate your identity from these platform issues, these things you care about. But I say this because when I talk about an issue, it really is just the issue. And it's an issue that is absent from whatever political party is in power or, political affiliation, what have you. Like when I talk about wages, man, there's just a lot of data around how wages lead to high quality employees. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. And I say that again as a meta conversation to encourage you, when I make those things separate, to keep those things separate and not treat the show as proof or opposition for whatever political issue you ascribe to. And I guess I will give one last plea. If you are crazy, into politics, maybe consider not, unless it's your job. I mean, I know people listen to the show who, they're in politics, literally, that's their career. I don't down you for that. I get it. It's literally your profession. But you hobbyists out there, your hobbyist keyboard warriors, I would just say, be careful. Be careful and think about, what is this adding to your life? But hey, what do I know? If this stuff fulfills you, more power to you. I don't say this rudely, but I really couldn't care. It's just great. Good for you. So anyway, that's our show today. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. We'll be back, I guess, next week for another episode of the show. And as always, I appreciate your support. If you're a first-time listener, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, drop us a review. And unless you hated the episode, then maybe don't leave a review, I guess. But all that to say, I so appreciate those of you who support the podcast, whether that's businesses who advertise on the show or people who support the podcast on our Patreon. That's at patreon.com/goodadvice. That's today's good advice. I'll catch you later. See ya.